Jake, it's a pleasure having you with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
No, it's entirely our pleasure. And it's also a pleasure you sparing such time to talk to us.
Oh, really happy to be here and to learn from you as well.
Let's see.
Okay.
Learning is always a two-way traffic. We won't go chronologically, but since we'll be introducing you to the viewers, we would first like to tell them who you are. So you are Athol Jake Preston.
That's right.
From Sydney, Australia.
Well, I was born in
Sydney, Australia. Yes. And I've been given to understand that you grew up in a farm.
That's
where you
right.
had thoroughbred horses and cattle.
Yeah, we grew mostly Arabian horses, which was my mother's dream.
For racing?
For endurance racing, which is a form of horse racing from between 80 to about 350 kilometer races.
Oh, wow. And you never planned being a jockey?
No, I was always too heavy. But my sister actually did very well and was a representative on the Australian national team.
Oh, wow. So this sporting gene runs in the family?
Well, I guess there's a little hope for me.
I can call you an Australian.
Yes, you may.
Yes. So being an Australian and not into tennis and cricket and swimming, how do you explain that?
Well, my father was actually a professional rugby player.
Okay.
When he was younger. Played first grade rugby league. And so everyone expected, as I grew up, I would also be a standard sportsman. But the sad truth is I have very poor hand-eye coordination and I'm not a great swimmer.
Okay, that is a frank confession.
It was something of a disappointment, I think, to my family.
No, what you have done after that, I don't think they'll be disappointed anymore.
No, I think, if I may be frank now, my parents have been one of my strongest supporters. At first, when I started all into the climbing, they thought I was mad. They said, "You're not climbing rocks, you have rocks in your head." But no, they've never once tried to discourage me, and I really owe them a lot for their support.
Did they think climbing was more dangerous than endurance racing?
Well, they'd seen me fall from horses and most of the times walk away fairly unscathed. I think for them, climbing was such an unknown activity. They'd grown up
on the flatlands.
Yep, in the outback, and for them, climbing was something they'd never seen. So I think it was a big leap for them to accept it.
Okay. Would your later studies and the way your educational and academic progression came, would that somehow account for the fact that you would choose a rather dangerous sport?
Well, my interest in climbing really only first occurred when I was at the Australian National University as an undergraduate, and at the time my real interest was in skiing for any sporting activity, but I was very fascinated with genetics, and so I did my first degree in genetic engineering, and for a short time I was working with CSIRO, which is Australia's largest scientific organisation. But we had cutbacks, and 6 months in I lost my first job, and it was about that time my best friend was a climber.
Uh-oh.
And so one day he invited me to come out, and it was
fun.
It was fun. I was terribly scared. It was just some multi-pitch rock climbing out of Canberra, but I had to borrow shoes, and the only shoes I had were probably 5 or 6 sizes too small, and it was the most painful and yet the most fascinating day I'd spent.
Okay.
And so from that point on,
so you got hooked.
I was hooked.
Yeah, I've been given to understand that you teach literature in Korea.
I do. Well, I'm at the moment working with an international business department, but I use literature. I have to teach some business subjects through English, but I also like to incorporate teaching English literature as a way of showing students that there is a lot more to learning a language than studying for a test. I think the great failing of much education is that it's all about test preparation, and then people think there is no use for this knowledge once they've finished a test. So I try to use literature, and I draw from diverse cultures with my literature, but to show them how important it is to life. So to inspire them to do more than test take, and perhaps to branch out in a new direction.
That's interesting. To get back just a wee bit, your full name, I was told, was Athol Jake Preston.
That's right.
Athol is from way back in Scotland.
It's a very old or Scottish or English name, but all of the men in my family have been, first name has been Athol. So
okay.
I am Athol Jake, so I am Jake. My father was Athol Douglas, so he is Athol. His father was Athol Theo, so he was Theo, and so on, probably until about 1066 when the name first came into the family.
Oh,
my grandmother had to chase our family history.
That's very, very interesting. Now, once you got hooked onto rock climbing, and then I suppose there's a natural progression to ice and snow and mixed rock, ice and snow, and the altitudes kept getting higher and higher.
They did, but in many ways I did things backwards. Not long after being introduced to rock climbing, I moved to China, and I was working at a university there for a few years. And I'd been traveling in a break, and I was in the far west around Urumqi. And as I approached, I looked out of the window. It is the middle of summer. It's 45 degrees, and we are sweltering, just melting in the train. And yet I can see these beautiful snow-capped mountains. And within 1 second of seeing them, I knew that I had to go to them. And so I began my real climbing career, climbing, borrowing, begging, stealing, buying whatever equipment I needed. And I went out to the area that I could see, which was part of the Tian Shan, near Bogdafeng, or Peak Bogda, which is about 5,445 meters. And I was all alone, and so I began my alpine climbing at about 5,000 meters. And it was only after I'd finished those 2 years, I went back to Australia and then hopped across the ditch to our brother island of New Zealand. And I did a technical alpine mountaineering course there. And that's when I realized how risky and foolish my adventures in China had been. But it gave me such a base to then go back and restart in a more logical and safe manner.
After you have, to put it literally, learned the ropes, so to speak, did you think that learning the ropes was important?
I thought it was the most vital thing, or maybe the second most vital thing. To learn was very important, but also I think who you learned from was a very important thing, that you had a good apprenticeship with someone you had a bond with, someone you could trust. In those days, we learned climbing by apprenticing ourselves to a more experienced climber. There were no climbing schools as such. It was very much a passing of knowledge, very slowly and in a gradual manner. But it was probably the best decision I made to go through that process of learning the ropes rather than...
I'll be moving forward a little now that we are on the subject. Do you think now that you have learned the ropes and have enough experience under your belt, do you think you'll make a good teacher?
there's always so much more to learn.
No, there always is.
But, I toyed with the idea of becoming a guide for several years.
Where?
When I'd been climbing in and out of New Zealand, in the Southern Alps, I became quite good friends with some of the guides there. Dave McLeod, Spoon, was one of my mentors. And there is a lot of crossover between being a professional teacher and then doing what guides do. It's not just being the best climber, but being able to communicate
your skills,
and also to have people skills, to be able to inspire and to encourage people and to keep people calm and to make them.
Being a guide in New Zealand, you think it's a viable livelihood?
Well, a lot of the people who become guides in New Zealand, they also work overseas. You have Russell Bryce, who runs Hymex.
Yes.
But these guides, born in New Zealand, they train in New Zealand, and it's a very unforgiving mountain environment. Some of the biggest relief of any mountain ranges happen in the Southern Alps. But they will often spend 6-8 months of the year guiding, maybe in Europe, in South America, the Himalayas, of course. So just guiding in New Zealand is probably not viable. But they tend to travel and guide worldwide now.
They're actually international guides.
They're really international guides.
Have you climbed with the Sherpas?
When we did our expedition, which was along with this guy, Dave McLeod, and it was helped organised by Russell Bryce from Hymex, we were climbing Shishapangma in Tibet, and he brought some of his Sherpas from Nepal across, and so we had that team. We were very mixed international, just a group of friends from America, Australia, New Zealand, and England. We kind of all just kind of knew each other. But we had, for that expedition, we did have four Sherpas from Nepal who joined us.
Did they go high with you?
They did. Sring and I think it was Tendup. They came all the way with us up to Camp 3 at about 7,200 meters. And from there we were going up past the Candlestick. And they probably were actually the most experienced climbers, and as most Sherpas are actually much more experienced than most Western climbers, so we're very lucky to have them with us. But the conditions that year were not really so good, and so we turned around just about there, at about
200 meters short?
About 200, it was about 7,800 meters. So.
Well, that's sad.
Yeah, well, it was sad, but I think it was a very good decision. The next day, I believe another team tried. It might have been the Italian or a Japanese team, and I do believe that they lost lives. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the summit is always optional.
Yeah,
coming back is mandatory.
That's right, and it reminds me of one of my last expeditions in 2013. Before we set out on it, Freddie Wilkinson sent me a nice little email from the USA. And he said, look, first of all, the rules are, please, Jake, remember, come back alive, come back healthy, come back friends. Finally, come back with a summit. But the last one is optional.
Yes.
And so there is a modern trend that values the summit over everything else. But if I don't grab the summit, it's not really the end of the world.
Now, putting that same philosophy slightly differently, would you think the quality of your climb, your line, the cleanliness of your climb, so to speak, is more important than the summit?
Which is a loaded question. Style and ethics. I look, personally, for the satisfaction of a climb, the the climbing style is probably at least as important as the summit, probably more important. Because an expedition is not just that one moment on the summit, it's the 90% of the work that goes in. I'm not really firmly in one camp or another about which style should be used, but if it's right for the team and it's by fair means, and it's important to maintain some kind of values when you're climbing, not just get to the summit at any cost.
No, I'll try and be a little more specific. Over the past decade or so, maybe a little longer even, there has been a trend for guided climbs to real high altitude peaks, which has resulted in the fact that socialites, rank novices, people who are seeing Himalayas for the first time in their lives, find themselves on 8,000ers. Because they have a purse which affords them this trip. Now they have to be literally spoon-fed from the base camp, and if they are lucky with the weather and their health, to the top and back to base camp. That is a recent trend in Himalayan climbing. And there is the other trend which mountaineers believe in, is opening their own route, fixing their own ropes, pitching their own tents, cooking their own food, and generally speaking, looking out for themselves in both fair weather and foul. Between these two, shall we say, extremes, is there a middle path?
I think there is a middle path, but I don't think that middle path belongs in the Himalayas. I think when people come to the Himalayas, and all credit to the Nepali government for its recent attempts to put some kind of limits on these rank novices and these completely unprepared people from coming at least to Everest, but I think these people would be much better off, and they'd get more satisfaction from their climb if they could be pushed away from these dangerous climbs where you really do need to be independent and have the skills to look after yourself and your team. There should be more direction for them to please go and practice maybe on some lower ranges, the Sierra Nevadas or the New Zealand Southern Alps, maybe some of the foothills, depending on where they live in the world. But I do firmly believe the more remote ranges, and it's remoteness more than height, these really should be the preserve of experienced people who are capable of looking after themselves. But then that entails the responsibility that those experienced people will treat the mountain with respect. And it hasn't always been the case. We've seen some examples of very experienced climbers and fantastic athletes, but not always leaving mountains in pristine conditions. But I think really it's got beyond a joke in some places that novices think they can buy tickets to the top.
Yep.
And I don't want to deny people a chance of the dream, because I came from the flat outback in the driest,
of course,
hottest country.
You don't want to deny somebody a dream, but he should qualify to attain that dream.
Well, if we look at a comparison between Everest as the Olympics, the gold, the finals of an Olympics for climbing, we don't let ranked novices who just have a big purse join the Olympics. Everyone must go through a qualifying process. And I think it's not unreasonable and it's not undemocratic to say that for these special peaks, we should not be looking down on the highest peaks in the world. We should be affording them a bit more veneration. and saying, well, if you want to be here, you must first go through a process.
Well, carrying on with the same stream of thought of what we were talking about, recently we have had a very tragic year as far as West Bengal is concerned in the Nepal Himalayas.
That's true.
To put it very bluntly, the mortality rates were 33.33 recurring percent, which is unacceptable in any industrial unit. I think it's also unacceptable on the battlefield. I mean, a battalion losing 33.33%. I think the only time they lost at that rate was on D-Day, when they blasted the breaches of France. After that, I mean, it was a case of, to bring back a horse analogy, you would understand, bolting the barn door after the horse has really fled. The West Bengal government is trying to bring out some regulations. The first regulation they have promulgated is that nobody above 50 will be allowed to go to the high Himalayas, which I felt was rather silly. Now, if they had a parallel promulgation, a parallel law that anybody above 50 is not allowed to get married, I would understand.
Well, that might actually help a lot of the problems in the world.
So, but what do you think about this law?
Look,
well, I personally thought it was silly.
For me, this is the first to hear the details of these promulgations. But yeah, I'm a guest in India. Suppose
the Swiss government said, if you want to go to Mont Blanc, you can't be 50 years and a day old.
Look, it is, as you said, ridiculous.
It is
because
ridiculous.
It does not address what is causing these fatalities and the tragedies.
Exactly.
I understand governments, policymakers, they like to have very simple rubrics, something they can cookie cutter apply to a problem. But I don't see that age, especially such a young age as 50. Gosh, I nearly finished my career now. It's perhaps well-intentioned, but poorly executed thinking.
Okay, that is putting it very mildly. Thank you. Your climbing has taken you all around the world: Alps and China, Korea, Tibet, Shishapangma. I had wanted to thank you then, compliment you and thank you for using the word Tibet. I found it very, very important.
Well, Tibet will always be Tibet. Everything is political, but there are still some truths, and some people will say, it's China. But it doesn't change the fact that it is Tibet.
Right, great.
I will probably never get let back into China now.
As Bengalis, let me tell you, we are one of the biggest fans of Chinese cuisine.
Oh.
Every third restaurant in this city would serve you Chinese.
Wow. That sounds like Australia. When I was growing up, I used to think Australia's national dish was sweet and sour pork. But look, the Chinese are not bad people, and it's not even the case that their government is completely bad. But as we know, worldwide politicians tend to serve very limited interests, let's say.
Yes. Talking of national dishes, I think the English national dish is still chicken butter masala.
Oh, I'm sure it is. But they argue that curry is not really a truly Indian invention, but the British attempt at replicating real Indian cuisine.
We won't go into that,
No.
because we are actually sitting in the first city of what used to be the Raj, before they took it away to New Delhi. Get back to the mountains. Now, since we were talking about the philosophies of climbs, what is the type of climb you really believe in? Small teams, big teams, siege tactics, guided climbs?
Look, to be honest, I've done well, not maybe a big team. The biggest team I've been involved with was maybe 10 people.
10's not big.
The smallest I've been involved in is solo. Honestly, I prefer smaller teams, but they have their own dynamic problems. I've had a team of 2 that I was on in Western China in Sichuan years ago, climbing in Suguniangshan. We were looking to do a new route on the south face. And we thought we were 2 best friends. It was the very same friend who introduced me to climbing. But the expedition really fell apart because of, with only 2 people there was no way to, when issues arose, there was nowhere for stress to go, and we kind of destroyed ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And somebody has to cook and somebody has to sweep, and if some person doesn't agree to the cook, well, you have a tough time. Yes, yeah. I quite agree to that. But I have recently heard of a team of 32 who went on a 6,000 meter peak, and there were 3 summiters.
What does that work out as a percentage? It's
I wouldn't even want to
9%?
calculate. I found it silly. I think it's a waste of money. Traveling expense, feeding expenses for 32 people. I think if you cut it down to 10, you would have 3 expeditions.
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends where this mountain is. If it's like a 6,000 meter mountain, perhaps in...
No, not too far in the Indian Himalayas.
Oh, in the Indian Himalayas. Yeah. Well, I thought maybe if it was in like North America.
Oh, no.
But this is... I understand there's arguments which have been made to me both ways. A big team generates a big income for that local region. But I question whether that is really true. And we have to think of the environmental impact and the cultural impact of these big teams moving through. Because it's like in the old days of when armies would move through an area. Mm-hmm. No matter the good intention, damage is done by big groups of people moving through.
Absolutely. Because if you look back in history of the first 3 or 4 expeditions that went to the Everest, traveled through Tibet, and the local people were quite scared of what is going to happen to them, because most of the surplus food that they had was bought up to feed the porters. So that thing is always there. Now that we are talking about the philosophies of climb, you have a project in hand, maybe 2-3 months or 6 months down the line. Like now you're headed for Piklenin.
That's right.
How do you prepare yourself for let's say a major climb? I would put it 2 ways. There is a physical aspect to it, and there's a mental aspect to it. How do you prepare yourself?
Well, I think maintaining a schedule and a routine. You have to learn to develop a system which works for you. I don't think there is a one system which suits everyone, but you cannot prepare for a major expedition unless you have already a lot of experience and good condition in any short time. It requires a commitment to doing increasing levels of mental training, as you said. It's probably the more difficult, and physical training with people like with myself, with a work schedule, a family. It's not always easy, but for me, I just try to make maximum use of my free time, and pick activities which will train my mind as well as my body. Mm-hmm. And I think, where I live in Korea, it's a very good training country to live in. The climbing gym where I tend to train, the manager there is a UIAA route setter for the World Ice Climbing Championships. Mm-hmm. And he himself is a fantastic climber. There's another Irish girl who trains there, and she's in the World Cup this year, and I think was placed 8th in the world last year. And it's working with these people who are very professional, but also very fun, and they still have the love and the joy of climbing. Mm-hmm. It's not like a job for them. They're maintaining that enthusiasm, even through the hard times of when you're training. Being around people who can do that really inspires you.
Absolutely. Among your varied climbing experiences, I'll go back to that a little later. You also do a little of cross-country cycling.
I do. I actually find cycling to be a great cross-training for climbing, but to be honest, it's a purely enjoyable activity in itself.
Low risk, great dividends.
Great dividends. I managed to put risk into it. 2 years ago, I broke my shoulder, and
going downhill.
I wish it was something as exciting. A young kid ran into my bicycle from in front.
You had to swerve,
and I tried to swerve, but it ended up terrible. But I guess in many ways, it appears to be a much lower risk sport than rock climbing, than ice climbing, and than the Himalayas. But I always find a way to injure myself. My wife hates me for it.
In your ice climbing things that you do, you have climbed one of the biggest waterfalls around. I've been told they do that in the north, in Finland, Sweden, places like that, where they actually reach the waterfall, they take a boat out into the sea, and they reach the waterfall and they go up there and come back down into the boat again. In Korea, I don't have to do that, but how did you get to this waterfall, and what is the story behind all this?
There's this it's an absolutely gorgeous waterfall, and every winter in Korea it freezes over. Well, most of the ice climbing in Korea is actually on natural frozen waterfalls. Korea is 70-75% mountainous. Lots of rivers, and it's probably the most famous of these climbs is called Towangseo waterfall, Towangseo Pokpo. It's 320 meters in vertical elevation, but it's actually a little bit longer. It's split into 3 kind of sections. And usually this waterfall and the area, it's inside a national park called Soraksan National Park. The region of the national park where it is always walled off. It's no public access. There is a small trail which goes up there. It's about an hour of good hard hiking, hour and a half perhaps. But it's only opened in the winter for ice climbers, usually for a very short time, for a few weeks, maybe 1 month maximum. And I was very fortunate that Kim Jong-hon, who runs my climbing gym, he got access for us, and so one day, about 4 o'clock in the morning, we drove from Seoul, where we live, across. It's about a 3-hour journey. We got to the national park and we hiked in, and it was a very fortunate day. The weather was just absolutely gorgeous. The ice was in good condition, very plastic. And there was no one, maybe 2 other climbers there that day. But it was a long day. Not technically hard climbing, but you have pitches which are, first pitches I think about 116 meters, 70 meters, and then about another 130 meter pitch. So it's an exhausting climb. But you get to the top, and then you can look out. You have the East Sea of Korea behind you on one side, and you can look out over this broken range called the start of the Baekdu-daegan range, which is one of the world's longest unbroken watersheds. It's one of the highlights of my life is having climbed this. it's hard to explain the great beauty of this ice climb.
Do you come back the way you go up, or is it easier way down?
Getting down is actually rather difficult. It could be done by rappelling down, but none of the experienced ice climbers will do that. They choose instead to walk off. There's quite a long arcing walk off of about 5 kilometers. It's in itself it's quite a challenging climb. The snow at that time of year is waist to chest height, very loose snow, and there's a little bit of down climbing in ice that's required, but for some reason it's very rare to rappel off. It's considered an unsafe way to descend from there.
Absolutely. Now tell me about your Himalayan experiences.
Well, it's nothing really to brag about. As I said, I'd done a technical mountaineering course with an outfit in New Zealand, and then one day when I was living in Korea, I got a call from, I think it was from Spoon, Dave McLeod, and he said, "Jake, we're off to Tibet. We're going to Shishapangma. We'd like you to join us." I said, "What?" And at this time I considered myself, a raw novice. And he goes, no, look, we've climbed with you in New Zealand. We think you'd be the perfect team member. So what do you say? And I said, well, I'd never imagined I could, go to the Himalayas. Well, I had been to the Himalayas and ascended some very small peaks on the trekking routes up towards Namche, Tengboche, Perishe, Gorakshep, Kalapata. But this was hiking. This was real expedition, and I was
sorry.
I really was confused that they would ask someone like me. But I was very fortunate. My grandmother heard, and she was a dear woman, more British than Queen Victoria in her own ways. Even though she was Australian, she went, "Oh, Jake, dear, that does sound like a thrilling thing. Do go." And so with my grandmother's blessing, I thought, well, perhaps I'll never get this chance. And when I'd lived in China, I'd tried for 3 times to get into Tibet and been refused each time. So this was a chance to both visit Tibet and to climb on a big expedition, and that's where it really began. And as I said, we didn't get to the summit.
But it was a good climb.
But it was a good climb. It was a clean climb. As we all came down, we were all healthy, we were all friends, and we picked up whatever rubbish we could find and brought it back to our camp, and we walked away probably more in love with the mountains than we'd ever been before.
Yes, Shishapangma is very beautiful.
It is, and even just the journey there from Lhasa to Shigatse and then through the small villages to the base camp, it was such an eye-opener. And after I'd done that, I knew, I'm not leaving Asia. I'm going to live here where I have easier access to the mountains. So that was where it started in the Himalayas, and then I got very interested in the Indian section of the Himalayas. I'd had one trip which was going to be in the Annapurna region, but it was cancelled at the last minute with some illness on our team. So then a friend of mine told me about Raja. She had done a trip with Raja up past Gangotri on the Gangotri Glacier. And so I got to know Raja Anindya Mukherjee. And it really took off from there. So I really owe him a lot of my experiences in the Himalaya. So I had a couple of trips up through the Gangotri Glacier area, attempted climbs of Janhukot, and then after the rainstorm and the huge floods which went through that area in early 2013, we were actually heading back up to that region, and we landed in Delhi, and that's when the IMF in Delhi said, well, it's impossible. They have rescue teams in, there's no road access. And so at the kind of the last minute we had to plan B, and we ended up in the Hakshu Glacier area of Ladakh in the Kashmir. It's truly such a stunning area. I understand why it is called Little Tibet, and for me it was also going to the Himalayas, in that part of the Himalayas was it had a personal connection, because one of my distant relatives, General Sir Ian Hamilton, had been stationed at one time in Multan and had actually ridden a horse across some of the passes and ended up in Leh back in the 1873, I think.
Wow.
And he's written about it in one of his diaries and his books. So it was a chance for me to retrace a little bit of family history.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. And when you go climbing, whether it's in the Alps or Tibet or the Indian Himalayas or the Nepal Himalayas, does the local history, geography, the food, the people, the music, the dress, does that play an important part in your journey? I
think it plays, for me personally, it's a hugely important part of the journey. If the Himalayas were, in Australia, and there was nothing new cultures or these kinds of experiences, it would be far less attractive. To me, an expedition, whether it's into, say, the Qinglai Mountains in China or the Himalayas to the Swiss Alps, the local culture, the colour, what I can take from that, what I can improve myself with and learn about other people. The trek in is always, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of any expedition. And I found peoples who live in these areas, the mountainous regions, beyond kind. The most, really open-minded, welcoming people, and that, I grew up on the farm, so I have a great interest in flora and fauna. I work in linguistics and literature, so I'm always interested to hear local dialects, and in my mind I'm trying to connect dots. This
sounds familiar.
Yeah, something. Even here I notice between Bangla and like Korean, I can pick up so many similar points in grammar, in vocabulary. And then the food, for about 8 years I was working with the Korean government on its Korean food globalization project. Back in Australia I'd done some studies in culinary and particularly in winemaking. And so I was brought in as a kind of consultant. And I've always loved food and I love cooking. And I go to these other regions.
Well, you tried for MasterChef Australia?
No, thankfully. But my uncle, who I grew up with on our farm, he'd been a chef. And so he really introduced me to this love of food, and to wherever I go, I'm very keen to try the local food.
You have any local food here in Calcutta?
Oh, when I arrived here, I showed my friends here a list that I'd made up of local Bengali foods and Kolkata specials that I know. And I've been very fortunate that they helped me try at least some of them so far.
I hope it agrees with you.
Oh, it always agrees with me. I don't think that Indians know how to do bad cooking.
Oh, yeah, that's a lovely compliment. Thank you.
Well, it's actually really true. I think,
I think people who love spices in their food would enjoy our cooking.
And if you don't love spices in your food, I should go to a doctor. There's something wrong with you.
Now, in all these years of climbing that you have done, has there been someone who you have read about, or someone who you have actually climbed with, whom you have idolized or tried to follow, or tried to look up to and try to be something like that, or do you break your own trail?
I think as a young kid, when I first started reading about climbing, and if you're a climber, you spend so much time reading about climbing, and I think there's a lot of connection between literature and climbing.
I have a personal take on this. Among all the sports that get written about, mountaineering literature as a genre has more literary stuff in it than any other sport.
I would totally agree. I mean, even if you look at something like the Boardman Tasker Prize, I can't think of another sport which actually has a literature.
A Don Bradman Prize for cricket
Yeah,
writing? I
haven't
haven't heard of it.
No. What the Pele Award for football writing? I don't think these exist. I think there's something. I'm going to misquote who this is, but it might have been an early American explorer who said something along the lines of that the outsides of a mountain are very good for the insides of a man. Or it might even have been Frank Smythe. But to get back to our topic, I was inspired by these early writings, particularly by people like Tillman, Shipton, and then once I'd started climbing, I never really think I've climbed with anyone famous, but then I guess some of the people I've climbed, I actually flew to Nepal with a famous Korean climber called Omahong Gil, who was the first Korean, and I do believe the first non-Sherpa Asian, or non-Nepali, non-Tibetan, non-Indian, to climb all 8,000 meter peaks. But he had his own very strict rules. I think he liked to do things his own way. So yeah, it was for a short time. Of course, like many people, I was inspired by the 8,000 meter peaks. But actually, when I flew, we didn't climb together. He was going off to Lhotse Shah, and that was when I was going to Shishapangma. He took me aside, and he explained to me that not to be fascinated by these 8,000 meter peaks, to look beyond that, and to look inside myself to find what climbs were right for me, and to find my own way. So I do owe him a degree of thanks for his caution. But I don't know if I have too many modern day idols. I mean, there are many great athletes and many great climbers. A lot of Babu Sherpa, for example, is an amazing person, and it does inspire me to see these people. But it also angers me to see that so much of the media is still focused only on the achievements of Western climbers. So these days, people like Raja are probably my biggest inspiration in climbing and exploring.
Oh, that's nice. He has done some very good exploration work in the Indian Himalayas, opened up new routes which have not been traveled in the last, I think, since the days of long ago. I think Douglas Freshfield and people traveled those routes, and I think John-Claude White, and he reopened those routes again.
But it's also his approach, I think, to the mountains which inspires me. That for Raja, like this trip we're doing together, it's not really about conquering the mountains, but it's for us to explore something new. Well, for us it will be new. Where we're going in Peak Lennon, of course, has been climbed many times, but his approach of taking the mountains as a place to expand yourself, rather than to try and gain some peak, to conquer anything, and to explore. think that is those kinds of climbers, and there are more than just Raja, of course, who go out and often in their own way, not on a commercial expedition, but with maybe an intimate group of people like-minded. They may be doing quirky routes. Like I said, Freddie Wilkinson inspires me in many ways. He's done some amazing climbs recently, and really over the last 10 years that were not really on other people's radar. And yeah, it's these people who are finding little byways and avoiding the crowds.
And not being a peak bagger whose basic idea of bagging peaks is to come back and have bragging rights.
Yeah, well, I think one of the sad things that people don't understand is you never can conquer a mountain. You might be permitted by good fortune and your own, good physicality to get to the top, but you have conquered nothing. Bragging for that belongs in some other sport, perhaps. But
I know people who do it.
Well, there will always be people who do it, and congratulations to anyone who has climbed these peaks, Everest and K2. It is a huge physical effort, and they do deserve some credit for this, but it's not my style. And I think the real joy isn't something you can brag about, because whatever climb you've done, the success and the satisfaction is really an internal thing.
While we are still on the Big Eights, did you have any future plans to go back to the Big Eights?
Look, no, not really. Obviously, within the Big Eight there's a lot of mountains. Some like K2, Nanga Parbat. These are 100% genuinely challenging. These are mountaineers climbs. I would love to believe that I was worthy of, say, an attempt on K2. But I like to be realistic, and I've got a family, and I love my wife, and she will climb with me sometimes. But perhaps under the right circumstances, with the right team, I could be tempted to one of these peaks. But there are so many more peaks unexplored or rarely climbed that also interest me.
And could be more enjoyable on the long run.
Yeah, it's the height. I mean, when we talk about 8,000 meter peaks, I think someone else said it's a very random distinction to draw. If we put it into feet, it makes no sense. Yeah, if we dropped it by 100 feet, we could put several more mountains in that grouping. And I understand why people want to have groupings of mountains and a firm idea of an achievement pattern. The 7 summits. I've even had a friend who did that. Søren Ork from Denmark, and he had a great time doing it. And I give him full credit. He's a wonderful person, but sometimes we miss the forest for these big trees. There's so much more out there.
After Peak Lenin, do you have something else on the radar?
Well, Raja's been whispering in my ear about something in Africa.
Okay, I'm privy to his plans in Africa. Whether you're aware of it or not, his previous trip to Africa, when he cycled from the equator to the Tropic of Capricorn, east coast to west coast, well, I was actually traveling with him, sitting at my computer.
Oh my goodness!
So I had a equally enjoyable time in Calcutta as he had there in Africa.
And probably not quite so dusty and hot.
And not quite so dangerous, because he had some pretty scary moments.
Cycling solo as he was through these I think it was 17 countries.
No, five. About close to 5,000 kilometers.
5,000 kilometers. Yeah. He must have had a few spicy moments.
Yes, very.
But yeah, overall, he's told me it was Africa. Yeah, he loves it.
Yeah, I know he loves it. There are health issues on these trips, which one has to be very careful about.
Yeah, talking about the cycling, it's something that's made me very much aware of hydration is long distance cycling. In Korea recently, just last month, we did a 320 kilometer one-day trip. But luckily, we had our set plan. But I think all training requires dedication to following a plan, and we made ourselves stop, and we had a plan to drink a liter of water for every hour of cycling. Well, probably Raja didn't have as much access to clean drinking water as we did.
Yes. So this next plan in Africa, are you on with him?
I haven't got permission from my wife yet, but I'll break the news to her.
I think you can ask Raja's wife to break the news to your wife, and they can both have a screaming match and spare both of you.
Well, I already apologized to Sangeeta for taking Raja away again this time, but she's a wonderful woman, and my wife Heyong, she's very understanding of my need to get away. And I think we were talking earlier about humans' need to escape all the stress of daily life, and that climbing is one of these rare things which is so cleansing. It is. People ask me, "What? Oh, climbing? That's some kind of extreme sport." No. It's much more for me like meditation. When you're focused on a climb, it can be a rock climb, a nice climb here, but everything drops away. It's like peeling off layers of an onion, and there goes the boss's emails. Now the next one is the rental fees is gone. Then something else, the bills are going, and you're left with a very, I don't know how to say, pure existence of just that moment.
I think most physical sports have to do with a sense of balance. So once you achieve that sense of physical balance, it also brings about a sense of a mental, internal balance.
A healthy body, healthy mind. As a doctor, people talk about psychosomatic effects, but I also think it goes the other way. I think by engaging in physical activities. So I think it's been shown in the treatment of depression and other mental illnesses that physical activity can generate these hormones, the dopamine, serotonin, and so on. Endorphins, thank you, yes. And this can have long-term health benefits, mental health benefits. And we've talked previously about some of the problems of the modern age, that children and young people particularly, and even old people, are not spending sufficient time in active leisures. And this is one of the great shames of the advance of technology. It's made us more sedentary and at the same time perhaps more kind of neurotic.
To look at it slightly differently, would you think that this is a form of escapism?
I will say yes, and I'll actually embrace that. People often use the term escapism with some negative
connotations.
With the connotations that, you're avoiding responsibilities, you're being immature, you're not contributing to society. But it was when, even today, we were going through the wonderful museum here in Kolkata, and it was pointed out to me that when people have free time, when they have sufficiency of food and shelter, they don't make armies, they make civilization and literature and arts. And I think it comes back to that people need escapism for the advancement of their personal health, but also for the health of the nation or the society. This is where we really develop and become civilized, is when we can have escapism. It may not be contributing directly to the economy, but without escapism, whether it is through poetry or art, or for us it is for climbing, without this escapism, I think we get into a very negative downward spiral of society. So I will say climbing is escapism, and good on it for it.
Great. I think on that very positive note, I will thank you once again for a lovely, lovely session. Thank you, Jake. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure too.